Welcome to another episode of Distory. My name is Kirk from walruscarp.com, and this evening we are continuing our Mr. Toad's Wild Ride series. It's kind of a micro series where we explore the creation, construction, and many iterations of Mr. Toad and his Wild Ride. And with me, as always, to dive right into this 1955 Disneyland classic first is Kate, the Disney Cicerone. Kate, how we doing this evening?
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into this one because we're going to 1955, which is like my era in Disney history. I love the 50s and 60s, and going to where Mr. Toad got its start as an attraction in the Disney parks is just a phenomenal story. And some things here that are questions that people have had about Mr. Toad for a really long time. We're going to answer some of those in this history and also explore some concepts that didn't quite make it off the drawing board for it. So very excited for this one.
Me too.
This Mr. Toad attraction, of course, was an opening day attraction for Disneyland, and it was the closest thing Disneyland had to a thrill ride in 1955, because you have to remember the Matterhorn wasn't put in until 1959. This really was like the original thrill ride of Disneyland, which is crazy, but it is.
Well, don't you think that's reflective, though, of Mr. Toad and his motor mania? I mean, it should be something that's a little bit more intense than a slow, dark ride. And this is still a slow, dark ride, but it has thrilling elements.
Yes, a lot of them. Yeah. So we're going to start off like we always do with these particular attractions when we dive into a series about an attraction. First, we covered the film. We covered the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, where this ride comes from, that film, which was a package film from the 40s. But now we're going to go to the concept of this attraction. How did it come to be? And so I had a little bit of talk about, how did they choose to have this ride in Fantasyland before we kind of get to the concept art, whatnot for it. So I'd love to head, if that's okay with you, Kirk, to the original prospectus meant to sell Disney to its investors.
I like it. Let's do it.
Okay.
We're going all the way back.
All the way back. So this is before Disneyland was built. We're talking 1953, 1954. They had to make these packages essentially to take around to investors and tell people what Disneyland was, because nothing like Disneyland had ever existed up until this point in time. It was a weird concept. They'd only known amusement parks and whatnot. So a theme park, the concept of a theme park was really strange. So they had to try to sell it to investors. And so they kind of did a write-up of all the different things. And so I'm not going to obviously go over those too much. They would take a long time because there's a lot of them.
Trust me, Kate wants to do exactly that, but she's going to reserve herself and not do that. Thank you, Kate.
I do.
New year, new you.
That's what we'll do for the next Historians Lounge when Kirk is away. So from 1953 to April 20th of 1954, there was no mention of Mr. Toad in any of these prospectuses that they made, any copy of them. They focused more on Pinocchio Square, Alice in Wonderland Dark Ride, Peter Pan, and Snow White. That was their four, was Pinocchio, Alice, Peter Pan, and Snow White. But in September 3rd of 1954, we see in this prospectus, it actually shows up talking about Mr. Toad. Actually, the layout changed. So you can see in this prospectus, this is a sketch from it. Oh, good. Kirk has it too. So you can see the four rides there are laid out in that kind of like, almost like square. There are two L's that are facing each other. And you can see Mr. Toad is on the right, where it is today, and Peter Pan underneath it. And on the left side is Snow White with Alice in Wonderland above it, where Pinocchio is today. So this is that prospectus. This is the concept that they had at the time. And you can see here, we have some of the text from it here as well. Around the courtyard will be 4 buildings, which will house the dark rides of Peter Pan Fly Through, the Seven Dwarfs Ride Through, Alice in Wonderland Walk Through, and Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows, which will be a ride through. The 4th dark ride will be Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows. His experiences are with an old-fashioned car of 1903 vintage. Mr. Toad does everything wrong. He rides through a haystack, he knocks over a cow, goes through a barn, and in the finale goes through the pearly gates with heavenly music accompanying him. Now, if you're familiar with Mr. Toad, that's not really how we end up in that one, is it, Kirk?
I don't know. It depends on what your version of the afterlife is, because some people might not be having such a great time. Do you think it's fair that Mr. Toad ends up in HE double hockey sticks versus heaven?
Seems like a pretty harsh punishment for just having a mania about motor cars, but I guess, you pay, what do they call it? You play, you pay. That's the moral lesson we're learning here.
I guess. I mean, in retrospect, in the Disney's version of it, he actually trades Toad Hall for it, and he doesn't get a stolen one. So I mean, there's like things to me that in the Wind in the Willows, he'd probably be more apt to head to someplace fiery, where I don't think in Disney's version he deserves it.
It's true. He goes to court. He's found guilty, and then he gets in the Disney's version. He gets hit by a train and then ends up in the hot place.
The hot place. I like it.
But so now we have this concept of pearly gates. Where does that come from? So this one we have to talk about Bruce Bushman. I think it's a Bruce Bushman sketch based on the writing that's on it that is from the same era that he actually made of it, but it wasn't called Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. It was called Motor Mania. You can see down there at the bottom, it also says World of Tomorrow, I think, which is so weird. Like, were they planning on putting it in Tomorrowland at some point? Did you see that, Kirk?
Yeah, I thought that was very odd. I'm guessing. I mean, it's hard to tell from we have zero input, it's just straight up. We're just reading from them.
So I kind of wonder if maybe they played around with the idea of having this in Tomorrowland for some reason, perhaps because of the car aspect of it. When they nixed Pinocchio, maybe when they nixed Pinocchio, they decided to put Mr. Toad in Fantasyland instead. But I think it might have planned to consider to been in Tomorrowland, which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
All right. So in this version of Motor Mania, we start out in a load area in the front, just like we would. We go into what is a dark adjustment area, which all of the Fantasyland rides currently have something like this. It's essentially a room that is incandescent light that then switches over to black light, right? We need like a transition between that. So that's what this is. This allows you to adjust your eyes a little bit so that you can see the lighting in there. Everything's going to be dark. Then we go into an area that says lightning and rainstorm with rain effects. The headlights then are reflected in a mirror in front of us as we go around a U-turn. And I love that. I'm going to say like the little things that he put in there for the sound effects are just like some of my favorite thing of this. So he says squeak, crash. And then in the rock slide U-turn, he says roar. In the next part is a little rock slide. Then there's a lightning crash and a tree falls and splits apart at another U-turn, and it says split. There's a bridge that you go over, which is a broken bridge that looks like your vehicle maybe like starts going up and then drops down. And it says crash. There's also a sign that says bridge out. There's a whole bunch of bumpy terrain. So a lot of these things show up later. So that's, I think, what's important. We go through this. There's bumpy terrain, and then we go through the center of a haystack, and it says girl screams.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Like, why is there a girl in the haystack, and why is she screaming?
Yeah, it's almost like, in my personal opinion, yeah, I feel like this is just a complete aside that took the country animation scene when Mr. Toad's like riding around or seeing the motor car in the countryside and just kind of threw together anything they wanted that made sense for the artwork of like what would be thrilling or exciting, not necessarily keeping on the storytelling. Like this is very much an aside and a different story.
Yeah, it's like let him have some mania on his motor car, going through random objects, anything that looks dangerous. Let's throw it in there. And so they have this haystack that he goes through with a girl screaming, and then it says there's a cow, and it says it's bumped, and then it pivots and moves. So you like bump the cow.
Yeah.
Then there's a cop siren, and it says squeak. You go through what is a double-sided cyclorama. So it looks like cyclorama is usually where there's like a scene in the distance. So they probably use like forced perspective painting to make it look like there's a scene on either side of you. And then you see car lights again. It says crash. Then you narrowly avoid a lamp. So that's important. Remember that for later. It says glass crash. You go through 3 trash cans, and it says can crash. And then you crash through a brick wall, which says masonry crash. You also then start seeing painted stars on the wall because obviously you've gone through a brick wall, which was not great. But apparently you didn't make it after that. Even after you just saw stars, you did a little bit more than that because you actually went to heaven. And you hear heavenly music as a gently undulating track. And then the pearly gates open, and that's how you exit, which is so different than what we have now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very different. You know what's funny though? When you showed me this, I had never seen this specific one for Motor Mania, and I had, even after you sent it to me, I went on a hunt online to try to find like more information, and it's like radio silence.
Right. It's so obscure. That's why I actually sent it to you, because I was like, he's not going to find this. It took me like 15 years to run into that one. It was a long time. So I was like,
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure you have this because it's fascinating. And it's also where they pull a lot of concepts for the 1955 version. So
Yeah.
wanted to make sure we went over that. There was another one that Bruce Bushman did that was another concept that he threw out there about doing that was about a roller coaster. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Kirk?
Yeah, I do have just a snippet from the roller coaster description. I found this description of the roller coaster from one of the original Mr. Toad cars. A ratty car went up for auction for $30,000. And in the item description, this is the only source I have about information about the roller coaster. The Toad ride was first considered as a form of roller coaster, with the cars following a downhill track towards obstacles, such as parked cars, which would move out of the way at the last minute. Disney ultimately decided that the ride would not be appropriate for small children and the elderly, and it was toned down.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what I have too. My source was Sam Genoway's The Disneyland Story, which is pretty well sourced. So I imagine he got it from somewhere legit, but I couldn't find anything else either. But this was a concept, we don't see any concept art for it necessarily that I have ever seen. It could be in the art library for, Imagineering, but definitely have never seen it. But it is interesting that the idea of making it into a roller coaster first and then toning it down also adds into the idea of it being the first thrill ride, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have another quote from Disney's art director Bill Martin, who helped design the ride, and talks specifically about viewing the film was part of the design process. I made the track layout to start with, but then we went through storyboards galore since the point was to convert Walt's cartoon films into rides in Fantasyland. Those dark rides were developed from the original 4x8 storyboards and concept sketches made for the animated films. So I did pull a couple of those up just because I think they're relevant you can see the origins of the ride vehicles, at least, because these are the original artist storyboards, and they clearly
yeah, you can see where the car goes. I love that. Toad's like flying out of the seat.
Yeah, it looks great, but this actually came from the manual eventually later on, so this was just like an early sketch of what they could look like.
Right. So. Well, before we get too much into car design, which I do want to do soon, I just want to say what happened then after that point was they decided to keep it on a flat track, right? And Walt's, if you remember from our previous Fantasyland,
yo, what up? It's Fantasyland, where they sell lots of Fanties. I hope they sell Fanty packs or Fanta Fanty.
If you remember from our previous Fantasyland series, we talked about how Walt wanted 3 emotions essentially in Fantasyland. Obviously, it probably would have been 4 because they were going to have 4 attractions, but ended up being 3 probably because of budget and time and whatnot. But it wasn't necessarily a retelling of the story so much as it wanted to evoke a certain emotion in you, right? So Snow White was like drama. Peter Pan was like the awe of the beauty of Peter Pan. And then, so Mr. Toad was more of like the fun, humor, craziness. That's what we get with that. And it did become Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in concept with Ken Anderson and Claude Coates, with layout by Bill Martin. And remember, Ken Anderson and Claude Coates, they worked on the original film. So that is why they used these storyboards that Kirk was showing you. So it's not the story. Yeah.
Can I show one other thing?
Yeah.
I've never seen this before, and I don't know its validity. And I don't even know if this auction item has any merit in history, but it was labeled, it's lot number 95075, which sold on July 2nd, 2014, but it's labeled Disneyland Mr. Toad's Wild Ride Illustration Group. So, and it shows, let me go back to you guys for a second and flip this on. It shows Mole's house, which I've never seen this before.
Interesting.
It's got Ratty's house.
Yeah.
It's saying like natural sod roof. And remember, these are like all 3D shapes where it's mainly flats in the actual attraction. It shows another. This is like a water wheel. And
Do you think this has got to be for Storybook Land canal boats?
Do you think?
Mm-hmm. Because that
is what
exists.
This is all for?
Yeah, because they had Mole's house and they have Toad Hall.
Ratty's?
They relocated. Well, they relocated a lot of it. It used to be on where Aladdin's palace, Sultan's palace is now in Storybook Land canal boats. That's where
I remember you
have
told
the
me that.
scene. Yeah.
Okay. The only reason why I said it's weird is because if you look at the very top, and again, like I said, this is something from an auction site, not from Disney themselves, but it says Disneyland's Mr. Toad Wild Ride Illustration Group, and they're dating it, though, 1953. It could then, of course, Wild Ride Illustration Group. I don't know if this was all lumped in. When did the Storybook Canal boats open?
1956. So my guess...
So who knows?
Because this does show up inside this attraction. We should pull that back up when we go through the attraction. Okay. Because this does come up as a flat, like painted part in the attraction. So interesting, though. That's an interesting find. Well done, Kirk. Well done.
I don't know, dude. I don't know if it's well done. It could be like this is located on fake auctions. You fooled yourself and ruined your history podcast.com. So I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but
well, that's interesting, though, because that does look an awful lot like Bruce Bushman's sketches. So it seems like it's probably his stuff. But what they ended up using that for is hard to say. Okay, so this one for Mr. Toad, they didn't make it exactly like the Wind in the Willows. Obviously, the final version is some serious departures from Wind in the Willows storyline. But it does focus on Mr. Toad's Mania, with the guest playing the role of Mr. Toad, which is the same as all the other Fantasyland rides, where you don't see Mr. Toad in the attraction necessarily because you are Mr. Toad, like you were Snow White or you were Peter Pan.
Toad.
You are the Toad. So let's transition a little bit to some ride design and layout. You talked about Bill Martin, who did layout for it, and he also knew the size of the floor, that it was going to be, and the size of the space. And that is how they kind of started deciding how they were going to subdivide this ride. What?
I don't know. I just like that Bill knows the size of the floor.
Well, he did.
Like he knows the footprint.
He knows the footprint. That's what I was trying to say.
No, but I like size of the floor. We can no longer use footprint.
The ride, they also knew that the ride was supposed to last a minute and a half. So that was going to help them determine how many cars to have on the track, how many intervals to dispatch them at. They knew they had a smaller space that to work with than Peter Pan or, anything, because it shared a building with Peter Pan. But if you look, at the way that's divided, Peter Pan has the bulk of that building, whereas Mr. Toad's kind of at the end of it. So they had a smaller space to work with, and that meant they could only have 9 cars on the track at any time versus 11 pirate ships. Now, Kirk, you said you want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of this ride. Did you want to go over that? We
can. I got fancy blueprints too, dude. Look at all of my size of the floors. Wow. I could see so many sizes of floors everywhere.
Now, is that the current version?
That's the current version. But I just like having a floor plan that delineates all the scenes out, because I honestly, I'm not that well versed and I need reference points because this isn't like second nature for me. Before we get into like ride vehicles and mechanics, I just found this really cool construction, and there's the building right there. Mr. Toad would have been that. If you look at this L, it would have been the upper part of the L or the top part of the 1, depending on if you play Tetris or not.
Right. Definitely a smaller space. And the vehicles, though, could turn pretty quickly because they had a 4-foot turning radius. I know at this point on a lot of their concept art sketches, it says Mr. Toad's Hot Rod, which I think is now how I'm going to refer to these cars from here on out. They
are hot rods.
Do you want to talk about what we got here, Kirk?
Yeah, so this is the Bruce Bushman concept art for the hot rods originally. And this is going to be integral because if you look at what these the depiction of this concept. It's very rare that you get to see concept art turn into basically exactly how the ride vehicle looks.
Right.
And we are probably 95% there after having these photos. So, or this concept art from Bruce Bushman. So
I have the full story of how that came about, but I'd love to. You said you had it too, so I didn't want to run you over.
well, hey, dude, you can.
I made a joke.
Look, I
did it.
Yeah. So, no, I like it. Why don't I start talking about aero development and then you fill in the gaps where I fail?
Okay, that sounds great.
Fair?
Yeah, go for it.
So, Mr. Toad's Hot Rods. So there was a company that was called Aero Development that was partnering with Walt Disney, and there was a letter that was actually dated back in January 6, 1953, when Aero was pitching not these hot rods, but instead the Lilybell riverboat for Disneyland. And it's kind of funny, if you actually look at this letter, it says, thank you for the inquiry on our stern wheeler boat. I regret that we do not have photographs or information on it. This is Arrow writing to Dick Irvine at WED over at Disney.
I think it was Bill Hardiman that wrote that from Arrow.
Okay, yeah, it was W.J. Hardiman, William Hardiman.
Yeah.
However, we are having these things prepared up and will forward you as sometime soon as they're completed. We are quite pleased with the amount of interest shown in the boat, even though the pictures we showed at the convention were very sketchy. This early interest caught us a little unprepared, as we have not planned on releasing or advertising it for another month. We are rushing it through, though, and you should have your copies very shortly. So, and that, again, was all the way back on January 3rd, 1953. And starts this crazy, awesome partnership with Arrow. And Arrow is going to be integral to creating basically all of the dark rides that are in Fantasyland. And the cool thing about those is that they utilize these ride vehicles. And I'm not going to talk about the ride vehicles 100%, but just like a little tidbits. The cars were made of sheet metal. The ones in Walt Disney World, they were fiberglass, so different. But the sheet metal cars weighed approximately 200 pounds and featured the various designs of the characters from The Wind in the Willows. Think Toad, McBadger, Ratty, Cyril. There were a total of 12 cars built for Disneyland that would accommodate roughly 700 guests per hour. Now, Kate had talked already. This is a 1 minute and 38-second experience. Every 11 seconds, a new guest. So this was considered relatively high throughput. And I do have a mechanic sheet, although this is from later on when they are doing New Fantasyland. If you remember when we did our Pinocchio series, we relied on these sheets quite heavily, these PDF sheets. And so this gives you a little bit more. Seating is 2 per vehicle, number of vehicles. I guess they built 12, but used 11 at the time. And they're saying the ride show trip time was 1 minute and 30. I like this operational standing capacity. The phrasing of jog, stop, load, ready, dispatch. I thought that was interesting. And then operational standard capacity. Theoretical is 654 and standard is 685. I wonder why those are different, because theoretical you would think should be higher.
People don't get it fast enough.
Right. Like you would think your operational standard would be lower than your theoretical hourly, because your hourly, you figure you could push that through faster. But dispatch intervals.
I've heard 700 is about what they get per hour, which is actually super low, like really low.
In today's times. I mean, back then when we had 700, it was a lot of people because there was only 1,000 on the earth. So
1,000 people here.
I like how the average ride speed, because remember earlier we said that this is a thrilling attraction. So it's funny because like when people talk about roller coasters now, or they talk about thrilling attractions, it's all about height. It's all about speed. It's all about distance. And angles. This is 6.32 feet per second. So it's not exactly fast.
No.
But if it makes you really excited, Kate, there are 3,930 feet on this area of floor plan.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's not that big of a ride. It's not that
No.
high capacity of a ride, but it is an absolutely iconic ride.
Hmm.
So much. I have a little bit more about the cars if you don't mind me filling in a little bit
Yeah, go for
extra.
the cars.
Because I had that wonderful book that was from Aero Development that was signed by Ed Morgan. Thank you to our Distory listener who gave that one to me. But the Aero Development name, I don't know if we've ever shared that on Distory before, but I'm just going to remind you, they got their name in a kind of unusual way. They went to meet with an attorney in town and he asked what the name of our business would be. Ed looked down at his tie and he had a stick pin that was an arrow. Ed said, Arrow. The attorney approved. He said, that's good. It puts you at the front of the phone book. So that's how Aero Development got their name, was just
Dude,
from...
you know what's so weird?
Think about it.
There's still lots of companies that are named as if they were in a phone book. Like, have you ever seen a business that's like AAA Storage or AAA Realty and all these, multiple A's in the beginning? That's for the phone book. Phone books, do they even print a phone book anymore?
I don't think so. That's part of culture that's just disappeared. Yeah. Anytime we got it in our driveway, we just put it in the recycling can.
The yellow pages, dude. Do you remember flipping through the yellow pages?
Oh, yeah. That's how you found somebody to fix your house or whatever. That's what you did.
Yeah. Dude, back in the day, because I was a video game nerd, I would call up my EB Toys and my Funko Lands to try to see if they had the latest video game. And I would flip through the yellow pages and I'd find the number. I'd dial the number. Hey, do you have this one? Can you hold it for me? So I'd call all these multiple places. I'd find a place that actually has the video game I want that's in high demand. This is way before pre-orders or any of that stuff, digital downloads. And they'd be like, yeah, I'll hold you a copy. What's the name? And then I'd have to go beg my mother to drive me to wherever this was. But I figured there's no point asking her if I don't know they have it. So I can put my name on it. Worst case scenario, I call them back and tell them to release it.
Yeah, that's part of culture that's just completely disappeared. Doesn't even exist anymore. So interesting it disappeared in our lifetime. We're so old.
Oh my God. People used to do that stuff for Furbies and Tickle Me Elmos. They would say, are you holding them? Beanie Babies. No, we're not holding them. This thing's crazy. We are not holding it. I remember one time, I can't remember the game, but the guy was just if you get here in a half an hour, it's yours. Otherwise, I'm selling it. And I was like, ah!
We used to have to do that at Best Buy all the time. We'd have to put stuff aside for people at customer service. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Going back to Aero Development here with the Lil Bell is what it's called, is Lil Bell. Not to be confused with the Lily Bell, which is, there was all kinds of Lily Bells in Disney history. But what happened to Aero Development before that time was they were making dusting equipment for Lescombe crop duster airplanes. And that company just kind of got rid of their contract. So suddenly they're scrambling and trying to figure out what in the world do we do because we need business. And so they see that something vague in the paper about Disneyland that they're not really sure what it is because nobody is at this point. And they're like, well, hey, we have this steamboat, called Lilybell, and they contact Disney. And that's where we got that letter that Kirk read between Richard Irvine and Bill Hardiman. So what they did was that boat, which was actually super small, I showed a few pictures of it, but it was not a big boat in any regard. It was really tiny.
Dude, that thing's huge.
It looks like it from the pictures, but when you actually see humans in it, it's they dwarf it. So it was operating in Oakland at the time, and they got permission from the city of Oakland to dry dock the boat. They put it on a stand and shined it up and whatnot at Mountain View where they were operating. Walt Disney, Richard Irvine, and Bruce Bushman all came down to look at the steamboat, and they walked right by it without even noticing that it was there, and they said they got a sinking feeling because they're like, oh no, this is not good. But they didn't even notice because it was way too small than what Walt Disney was thinking of for a steamboat at the time. So as they were talking, though, they saw something else that was on the property, which was a Ford Model T car, which it is here with Walt Disney in it. And that they had made. It's a little miniature Ford Model T. So Walt Disney came along and looked, and I saw him looking, and some of his people nod. So at that point, they gave them the Bruce Bushman sketch, which Kirk showed you earlier. And Bruce Bushman said, well, I think what we'd like you to do is have you make one of the cars from the sketches I brought with me. Don't assume these are final, but they're pretty much show what we're looking for. And so Morgan agreed then to make a prototype. So they did make that prototype. It was made of sheet metal. And he said no drawings were ever made of the car, not a single drawing. I lofted one. And when that was locked, I took templates from it. And from the templates, we built the subsequent ones. But the templates we were able to cut out of sheet metal parts. The templates, which were cut out of plywood, showed the line of the fender and the line of the hood. And we went directly from a handmade prototype templates and to the parts. And that was a big difference between us and Disney. Everything they did was superb. They're welders, they were artists, they could write a book on the subject. Everything they turned out was like that. There were times we did things just because it was necessary for survival. He said, poor folk have poor ways. So he's essentially saying, while they would have, even Disney didn't always have blueprints, to be fair. But that's their impression of it, was like, oh, they're working with all these big professional people and we're just kind of like flying by the seat of our pants here. Or like, they're like, can you make this car? And like, sure, we can make the car. And then, that you can imagine the panic of them later, like going back and like, how in the world are we going to make this thing? Right. But they figured it out because they were mechanics in World War II. They knew machinery really, really well. And so they made these kind of like, wild fenders that were kind of like bendy and whatnot. And they made the back somewhat sloped backwards. So it looked like you're kind of like flying through space, just like that concept art. If you look for Bruce Bushman, you can see the curvy fenders and the laid back seat as well. He said it was supposed to be a wacky look is what it was for. But they also had working headlights, which I think is really fun because they don't have those now. And we'll talk about that later. But they were powered by a quarter horsepower electric motor with a small guide wheel in front for the T-track that was on the floor. And so, of course, Arrow went on to make all kinds of Disney rides we know and love, including Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. And Walt Disney World was unfortunately the last time they really worked with Disney. And then Disney after that was like, we're going to do everything in-house now. Thanks, but see you later. So that was the end of their association with Arrow development.
Wah, wah.
Wah, wah. But, all right. Shall we move on? I love that picture, by the way.
Well, you said wacky, so I was like, wait, I have a wacky picture.
It's Jerry Lewis. Yeah, that's a great one.
So we talked about the vehicles and you talked about the motors, but I want to talk about like the tracking itself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We need to go back and do that. Sure.
Yeah. No, it's good. This all works together. So the ride vehicles were mounted on a steel track system, which were known as bus bars. And the one thing that's great about it, and again, I think this adds to that layer of, we had mentioned it many times, but the fact that the track had such a short turning radius allowed it to have these sharp, twisty turns, which although it was slow, it was agile. And that agility led to that chaotic, frenetic driving style of a motor mania, Mr. Toad, if you will. So that unpredictableness is really, really important. And I also think it's fun that they had those wheels, and of course, they don't do anything. So, like, kids could drive all they want, but no one's in control. The ride is in control.
What?
Well,
I'm not driving it?
Yeah, well, this would be like an amazing time to get the photo of you on Indiana Jones where you're driving recklessly.
We don't need to see that one again. We're good.
It is my favorite picture of you ever.
It's a horrible picture of me.
It's
horrible.
It's the greatest photo ever. There are those, Kate was talking about painted flats. We are going to notice that there are doors that operate mechanically, that are the bump doors, which sometimes work, sometimes didn't.
Some of them didn't work at all. Like some of them actually weren't automated. Some of them were where you'd actually hit.
Smacked into them. Right.
Yeah, on purpose. Yeah.
But then actually talking about the physical metal track that's underneath that you can see to today on all these old dark ride systems is the bus bar, which is an electrified metal rail that supplies power to the ride vehicles. The vehicles make contact through a bar through a conductive brush or pickup arm, allowing electricity to flow through to that electric motor that Kate was talking to earlier, and then the physical track itself drives it around. The system does, however, have a safety protocol basically it's the amount of electricity so that it can't go higher in terms of the maximum speed. But it's all powered through DC or direct current. Any AC/DC fans out there, you get your direct current. So there you go.
I was trying to think of some lyrics. All I came up with is back in black, and I can't.
Dude, I don't know.
Chaotic kids.
Go ahead. All right,
we are going to talk about how they painted black, so I guess
that's what. Yeah, that's what. That's called a segue.
Well, I do want to segue to that, but before we do, I just want to mention that they actually assembled this entire track on a soundstage in Disney Studios before they put it in Disneyland. So they tested the attraction there with noise, the sirens, the turns, the bump doors, everything, the straightaways, all the things, visual obstructions. They did all the staging of it there, and then they packed it all up, and then they brought it to Disneyland, which caused a problem later, which we'll see as we go along. So stay tuned.
People in Emet, like back then in WED, they would always go past this when they were doing the installs and doing some of the test runs, because those cars would always be smacking up against the doors, and they'd be like, yo, this place is bumping in here.
I love it.
It was. They were bumping in there.
So great. So let's paint it black. That's a different song, but let's head to the painting portion of this episode. Claude Coates, of course, did the color styling on The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, also with Don DeGrady, John Hench, and Mary Blair. So all of them worked together to do the color styling for that film. Claude Coates said it was a picture I'd worked on, and now it was a ride, and Walt thought I should do a model, paint a model, which I've never seen. I have looked everywhere for this painted model. I don't know if they just trashed it or if it's just hidden from public view. I've never seen the original model of Mr. Toad, but we know that it exists because Claude Coates made it.
Do we?
So, do we?
Do we?
Was he telling the truth? Claude Coates then assumed his tabletop model would be used as a guide for the set design by the company hired to paint the scenic flats for the attraction, which was called Grosh Studios. After Walt had approved the model, Claude Coates believed he was done and would move on to the studio's next film project. That was his plan. He was like, I made your model. I'm done. I'm going to go do some more background art for whatever is our thing we're doing next. But here's one of the tales I've heard about how he ended up on Mr. Toad. Now, there's with any Disney history like this, there's always a little bit of like lore involved, and they always dramatize it a little bit. So this might be the dramatized version, so take that with a grain of salt. But weeks later,
drama.
While talking with Ken Anderson, who dropped by to chat, Walt Disney came into Claude's office with his bangs apparently falling in his face and his eyes pinched in irritation. So dramatic. Faced with yet another delay in park construction, Walt said, he pointed to Coates and Anderson and said, Grosh Studios can't do Mr. Toad, so you guys do it. Which does sound like something Walt would say, to be honest. So R.L. Grosh and Sons Scenic Studio, also known as Grosh Scenic Studios, had been hired by Disney to create all these scenes for Fantasyland. But because of time and labor constraints, Grosh came to Walt and said they just couldn't do Mr. Toad's Wild Ride and finish in time. They're just like, sorry, dude, like, we're not going to get this done. So it's possible that Grosh also had difficulty matching the blacklight paint to the film's color palette. So not really sure exactly why, but they're just like, we can't do this. So Claude Coates then was added to the project as art director and show designer, which effectively ended his career as a background artist at the studio. And instead, he became an Imagineer at that point. They weren't quite called Imagineers yet, but that's what happened with him. So he said, this was a new experience for me. After painting backgrounds the size of a cell for 20 years, suddenly I was faced with painting backgrounds of up to 18 feet high and with blacklight, which was a new material for me. We got it done, found out how to do it, and then worked with the engineers about the track and so forth. We had it done for opening day. From then on, I worked at Disneyland things. So from then on, he was just Imagineer. That's how we know he went into other projects. We know he worked on Alice in Wonderland. He worked on Pirates of the Caribbean and Haunted Mansion. a lot of the classics, Clyde Coates was involved with those. And we talked about him more in our Snow White series, so I'm not going to get too much into his career. But I love that people said he successfully transferred the Disney magic from the film to the attractions he worked on. So if you think of like, he always created the mood, the atmospheric things, right? The fully immersive environments that we feel in those early Fantasyland rides, a lot of those had to do with Claude Coates' environment and input, especially in this particular attraction. He created scenes that they said were far beyond anything that had ever been achieved in the scenic medium before, which is pretty amazing. So,
man, if you like him so much, why don't you marry him? Really talented. Dude, you know what? I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about them. Like, they're like,
no, I was gonna say, I'm like,
no, not you, dude. I'm talking about like everybody who works at Disney back in the 50s who were like, oh man, Claude.
It was hard to not like Claude Coates. He was like mentor to everybody. He was the gentle giant. He was 6'6". He was, look at how tall he is. Painting us.
I love that they're showing that they did like projection of the individual cells, you know, and they basically just use that to do the backdrops. I mean, because a lot of these things were developed for this ride, but they printed them and then projected them and then painted them on, which I think is so cool.
Yeah, you can see on the back of this guy, you see the projection on his back, and then you see him painting.
Oh my God, they painted him?
That guy's not actually there. He's just a painting.
Holy cow, he's a flat?
He's a painting of a painting. Yeah.
He's what?
I do have a couple of notes about blacklight paint too before we move on.
Wait, is that guy real?
This is Claude Coates painting his signature style, which you remember when we did that Snow White series and he largely was involved with the Walt Disney World version, how he had that like style that was really unique. And we really see that come out in this 1955 version. It's so much Claude Coates in his style. I just want to mention the blacklight paint that they used because this was revolutionary at the time. We'd be remiss to not mention it at least. Claude Coates said it was in blacklight, a new technique for me. We thought all the rides were going to be in blacklight. I think we talked about this when we did our Big Thunder Mountain series because we talked about the Rainbow Caverns because he used the same technology there. But obviously not in water for this one.
I think we talked about it in Pinocchio too.
Yeah, it's been around. But basically, blacklight paint is specifically formulated with pigments that respond to ultraviolet light. Paint and ink pigments absorb various light frequencies, visible and invisible to the human eye, and then re-emit them, reducing intense visible colors that appear to glow even in daylight. So that's how blacklight works. The paint was developed between the 30s and the 50s by the scientists at Schweitzer Brothers Incorporated, later called Dayglow Color Corporation. So the benefit of using blacklight paint was that they could make the small space that Mr. Toad was in, they could make it appear larger because if you paint everything black in there, it's like the walls disappear. And then you can make anything you want pop out at you with the blacklight paint. And so that was the benefit of using it specifically for this attraction because they were working with such a small space. So Claude Coates said, you could force perspective in paintings. The fact that if you're right next to a wall, you can make it look like a roadway goes on and goes off forever. And people know it's a painting, but it has an illusion. And the black light is a better illusion than it would be if it were painted like a mural in physical light. So he's saying, we've always seen these kind of like these forced perspective paintings where things look like they go off into the distance. But he's saying it's even better with black light because of the more depth perception that you get with this thing glowing, essentially is what he's saying. These scenes were painted in the special effects building on the studio's backlot, which was a corrugated steel building built for Bob Matty, specifically for work on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1954. So they repurposed that building essentially, which you can see in this particular photo. If you look at the top, you can see that corrugated metal on that building.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it had neither heat nor air conditioning. So you can imagine how great that was in the Southern California sunshine. I have just a note about the lighting that I found. It says the lighting becomes one of the very hard maintenance things in these particular attractions in Fantasyland because the lights have to be adjusted and very carefully to aim at a certain figure or whatever story point you're telling has to be illuminated. That's what Claude Coates said. So sometimes the fixture had to be turned around to replace a bulb. And when people would like turn it back around, they wouldn't put it in the right place. So it wasn't illuminating what it was supposed to, because the maintenance guys aren't the same as like the Imagineering storytellers, right? So Yale Gracie actually designed a specific system where the fixture is locked into one position. So the lighting was always correct after maintenance, which I think is pretty inventive of him, the Illusioneer Yale Gracie.
Illusioneer.
The Illusioneer. Well, before we go on to actually installing this thing in Disneyland, I think we have to take a quick little break and hear about maybe some things that are going on over there at Walrus Carp. Kirk, what do you do these days?
I am knee deep in design work and app work right now. So it's all about Valentine's Day. So working on those kind of designs. And then, of course, I actually have a couple of projects that are in the cooker for the next couple of months that I've been thinking about for quite some time. And they're a little bit bigger projects than normal. We have an app in development, which will help you navigate both dining, wait times, crowd calendars, all that good stuff. But then I have something else that I've actually talked to Kate about before that's wearable and involves a little theme park magic and a little motivation. So I'll leave it at that.
Excited. Yeah. Love the teaser there. Hope to see what comes up.
How about you? What's cracking over with the Cicerone?
Well, I am hopefully any day now. My Audible will approve my audiobook for Who the Mirror Reflects, which is the third book in the Pixie Dust in the Park series. But I realize I haven't talked about the first book in that series in a really long time, and they do stand.
About it.
They do
There's
stand.
The first book.
They do stand in line for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in this book, and I don't know how much, I can't remember. It's been a while since I've written this one, but I do know that they are at least in Fantasyland, in Disneyland in this book, because this one is placed in Disneyland. So this is about two Disney history live streamers who find love in the shadow of Sleeping Beauty Castle, but with one of them hiding a dangerous secret, their fairy tale romance might just unravel into an unhappily ever after. So that is what this story is about. This is the very first novel that I ever wrote. So this is very near and dear to my heart. I did write a book before this, but it was nonfiction called A Glimpse of the Magic, Finding Ourselves in the Disney Story. So this one is where the Firefly stands. If you are somebody who loves Disneyland specifically, this is kind of a mental escape for you to go there and hang out in Disneyland with this really sweet couple, Lucas and Leah. So
I could see these being options as films.
They would be really fun as films.
They would, I mean, obviously they would have to take place in the parks because without the parks, it doesn't exist. But they would be great story. Come on, tell a story in the park. How great would that be? And it would sell the parks.
It would, yes. So anyway, so I have that, and then I'm mostly trying to finish up another book that I'm trying to release in the next couple months, which is a sequel to A Glimpse of the Magic, and it's a nonfiction, and it's just a collection of writings about to incorporate Disney history, encouragement, inspiration, and some life lessons as well, some that even I have learned. It's writing those books is also always super vulnerable for me because it is sharing kind of pieces of my life and my process with the world, but I think it's important that we do that. So that's coming as well in the next couple months.
I love it. I love it. Keep them coming. We love to read. We love to learn.
All right. So let's go back to Mr. Toad. I have just kind of some things that happen leading up to opening day. Not everything went swimmingly. There were definitely some issues happened with Mr. Toad. There was a lot of strikes and a labor shortage that happened while they were constructing Disneyland. And so Ken Anderson gave this account. He said, the electrical sabotage on the day of opening, things were beginning to work along. And then all of a sudden, things in Fantasyland quit. And they found that the lines had been cut on opening day. There were all kinds of strikes and labor problems. It was so discouraging. And even though I was in a position of an underling as far as anybody was concerned, I was in the position of heading up the building of those rides that I was involved with, which meant I had to be the one that was in contact with the subcontractors, the carpenters, the painters, all those people. I directed them trying to get this thing completed. And these were the Orange County people who were counter to the unions up here. The first ride I got built up here was the Mr. Toad ride, which was built right here in the back. They took it down to install it. These people were still members of the same union, AF of L. They resented the Hollywood craft unions having developed these things. They scraped all the paint off the little car and the little circus train and painted it over again with their own guys, but not nearly so well. There would be guys doing all sorts of niggling tricks to prevent and to sabotage, and I'm sure Walt couldn't have been any more furious about it than when he was trying to complete it. So basically, there were some unions that were fighting with each other and sabotaging the project as they were getting it built. So it makes sense that Walt would come in and be like, these people won't paint this thing. Like, you're going to paint it now. Like, he was just like, I'm done. So I talked about how the track had been developed at Disney Studios. And you can see this is the layout of the ride, which we'll get to in our next episode, I think, the going inside this attraction. But if you notice, Kirk, how this is like, it's a big box, but then there's a big offshoot for HE double hockey sticks.
Like a little, yep.
Yeah. So here's what happened. They went to install the tracks from Disney Studio and it didn't fit in the building, which is bad news.
So you're saying that they didn't measure the floor space correctly?
They miscalculated the floor space, likely failing to take into account the maintenance room and the Mad Hatter shop, which you can kind of see in this picture that Kirk has up here. So Ken Anderson talked to Walt about the problem, and he decided to just knock out a corner of the building to make a small annex, and that is where you went to the hot place, was in that small annex. Ken said of relocating the rides from Burbank to Anaheim that it was somewhat akin to building a house of cards with each card weighing 500 pounds. So, and they were doing all these at the same time. You think of like all these, they built all these attractions, like even Peter Pan was also built off-site at Disney Studios and then had to be brought over. But that one fit in just fine, but this one did not. So I think it's funny that they're like, well, we'll just have to knock out a wall and build an annex, because what else are you going to do?
Well, I mean, nothing. The one thing in life that I know is a certainty is that it won't always go right.
Yep, that's so true. So they just adapted and they made it happen, and everything came out okay in the end there. But on opening day, there's a story of some of the people from Aero Development. I think it's Ed Morgan. They were watching kind of all the rides basically fall apart the entire day of opening day. Everything stopped working opening day. It was a nightmare. Like, I think they had 2 Autopia cars at the end of the day. All the boats kind of crashed out on the canal boats of the world. Dumbo wasn't even operating. The teacups like kept cracking. Every morning they would have to go in and spend 2 hours like welding the teacups back together. Because everything was so new and like they'd never tried it before. And so they were learning kind of like as they went, right? So opening day was a bit of a disaster for how much the things actually worked. And Mr. Toad was no different. They had used these hinges that actually didn't make it. And so the ride was open for 8 hours, which was about 2,500 cycles on the door hinges. And Ed Morgan realized they weren't going to survive. So he ran out to a war surplus store, an army surplus store in Anaheim, and bought a dozen heavy duty hinges and then replaced them after that so that the doors wouldn't fall off.
Oh my God. Have you imagine like you slam into one of those bump doors and boom, it just goes flying.
It's like flies over your head.
Yeah.
They're like, that's really meant that they really ride.
Well, they open like this, so I think you'd be okay. I think it would just be like,
it just falls off. Yeah. Well, I mean, the same kind of things happened like Peter Pan. I don't know if you know the story. I made a post about this before, but in Peter Pan, there was a part where like the ship kind of ducked down on the track, and then they tried to shoot at you with a cannon from like, I think it was Captain Hook, shooting at your boat. And they said something about like, get them essentially. I can't remember exactly what they said, but this elderly couple was in the pirate ship and they shot the cannon at them and they fell. The whole boat actually disengaged from the track and fell down like, I don't know, 8-10 feet down. And they came off like, rubbing their hip, being like, wow, that was really realistic. Right?
Oh my God.
There's Frank Thomas told that story of opening day. And he's like, yeah, so obviously they fixed the track so that didn't happen again after that. But that was
scary.
That's the most thrilling ride, I think, in Disney's history.
They're really lucky somebody didn't get severely hurt.
Yeah, well, we'll learn next week about one of the first lawsuits in Disney history and how it's associated with Mr. Toad. But I think we do have to pause there because we're just out of time for this week. But we will start next week at the beginning of Mr. Toad. We're going to head the exterior of it. We're going to go in the load. We're going to actually get in and take a ride through the 1955 version of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, which I cannot wait to do. So, Kirk, do you have any
exciting
final thoughts here as we wrap up?
Bus bars are electric. Woogie, woogie, woogie.
I can't think of anything. I was like, we'll be back in black next week. I got nothing. Like, I don't have good jokes for this series.
We got to continue our wild ride, right?
Yeah. We'll be merrily on our way to the exterior of a 1955 attraction. I don't know. I got nothing. I have nothing.
I prefer every week you struggle through it, honestly. I think that should be our cadence.
Yeah, that's real. It's real. The struggle is real over here. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us for this episode of Distory. We hope you enjoyed this wild ride of how this ride was created, and we'll definitely hop into a hot rod with Mr. Toad next week and go through this 1955 attraction. But until then, have a really great week, and we'll see you next time for Distory.